Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of CSI Skill Tree. In this new series, we'll take a close look at video games to examine and celebrate the work they do in envisioning the future and building rich, thought-provoking worlds. My name is Joey Eschrich, and I'll be your host today. I'm the editor and program manager at the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University. Video games, we believe, are an incredible force in the global culture industries that fuel our imaginations, but they can also be intimidating and insular, and they can feel like unknown territory even to media critics and scholars. So in this series, we're going to talk with game developers, critics and journalists, fiction authors, and others who work at the intersection of technological change and storycraft. And we're hoping to provide a more accessible way into the conversations about how games unfold stories and make people active participants in possible futures. Today, we'll be discussing the game Waking Mars, which is about space exploration, gardening, and ecosystems. It's developed and published by the independent studio Tiger Style in 2012. And if you're looking for it, the game's available on Windows, Mac, and Linux, as well as iPhone, iPad, and Android devices. In Waking Mars, you take on the role of Liang, a space explorer and scientist searching for Octo, a robotic explorer who has made surprising discoveries in a system of underground caves on Mars. And in the game, you work with a mission controller named Amani and an AI named Art to track down Octo and unravel the mystery of the strange life forms that inhabit these caves. And I'm honored to be joined today by Katherine Buse and Steve Desch. Hi, Katherine. Hi, Steve. And I'll briefly introduce each of them. Katherine is a PhD candidate at the University of California, Davis, where she researches the relationship between science and speculative media. Her current project, which is titled Speculative Planetology, Science, Culture, and the Building of Model Worlds, is about how planetary epistemology co-evolved both in the sciences and in science fiction literature, films, and video games. Steve is a professor of astrophysics in the School of Earth and Space Exploration here at ASU. He studies the formation of stars and planets from a theoretical perspective, especially using meteoritic data. And he's also leading a NASA-supported effort to devise strategies for searching for habitable conditions and life on exoplanets. The three of us will talk for about 40 minutes and then turn to questions and comments from you. So please use the Q&A button that you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom window to submit a question or comment. You can do that anytime during the event. So like whenever it occurs to you, please just do it. And we'll have a period of time near the end where we'll focus on those questions and comments and responding to them. So we'll start with a short video that's going to be about 4 minutes long, where we edited together a few key story beats from the very beginning of the game. So you can get a sense of the game's premise and setup and meet some of the main characters. So without further ado, let's get underway and check out that video.
Amani, are you receiving this? I have encountered some of the Zoa.
Congratulations, Liang. You're the first person to make contact with extraterrestrial life.
They appear to be the Halid, same Zoa discovered by our robotic explorer. They are beautiful and strange, but not so unlike plants on Earth.
A Zoa cannot be classified as a plant.
True. The movement is more like that of an animal. I wonder if they're aware of me. I am holding in my hands a seed from one of the Halid.
This cannot be classified as a seed.
Don't worry, Art. It's just a convenient way for us to refer to them.
There is fertile terrain nearby. I will attempt to plant this. Amani, there is something troubling to report. One of the cerebrain life forms grows here.
And let me guess, it's covering the entire passage.
It appears that way, unless there is some alternate route.
Well, you know my theory. They form airtight seals to filter nutrients. You're not gonna find a way around it. But remember what Octo discovered? Just do that.
Then I will attempt to reproduce Octo's results, planting more Zoa to open the cerebrain.
So that works great. Grow plants, the cerebrain open. They shouldn't stop us from exploring the cave.
Yes, but I worry planting Zoa will have an adverse impact. Suppose we find cerebrain growing extensively.
That seems unlikely. Octo only encountered a couple of them this close to the surface anyway.
Attention! I have discovered a cerebrain in this chamber.
Or maybe things have changed since Octo was here. Well, look, even if there are cerebrain, we need to keep planning, or it's gonna be a short mission, right?
Yes, for now that is my response as well. So you detect no other way to proceed through the cave?
No! You must create new life forms of Mars by hurdling protocaps with your human arms.
Protocaps? Did you just invent that word?
Yes, I have a creative module.
By protocaps you mean seeds, though. Growing plants with seeds.
Yes, that is how humans communicate.
The opening scenes we just saw in the video introduce you to the game's cast of characters, as I said, and to the Martian life forms at the center of the narrative. They also hint at some of the game's themes and preoccupations, and they introduce the core gameplay, which involves basically, as they said in the dialogue, planting seeds and growing these strange creatures in order to progress. So as Katherine, Steve, and I have the first chunk of our conversation here, we're going to run some footage on silent in the background from a little bit later in the game, so everyone can see just a little bit more of the moment-to-moment gameplay, and we'll kind of run that as sort of a screensaver over our conversation, just so you get a bit of a feel for the game as we introduce it and begin talking about it. So Katherine, you were instrumental in picking this title, Waking Mars, as our second game in the series, and we've all been very excited to explore it and play it and learn more about it. What inspired you to recommend it to us, and what made it stick out in your mind? After all, it's 8 years old at this point.
Yeah. So first, I'd like to thank you, Joey and Bob and Tyler and the ASU Center for the Science and the Imagination. I'm like insanely excited to be here and talk about this game with you and Steve.
You're very welcome.
So I had played basically no video games beyond like Mavis Beacon Teaches Typing until my late 20s. And then all of the cool kids in my like English program were like studying video games. And so the second year of my PhD, I decided to teach myself to be a gamer, like sort of de novo, having had no previous experience. And Waking Mars wasn't the very first game I ever played, but it was the first one that I loved playing and that made me understand like the sort of importance and affordances of this medium. So I've been involved in the environmental humanities for a lot of years, and one important theme in that field is that ecology is the science of relationships, right? That it's relationships between different non-human life forms and relationships between humans and other other life forms. And Waking Mars captures that relationality, in my opinion, really, really well. At first, you think that the relationships are sort of conceptual relationships, like you're thinking about the biomass of different plants and how to make each one, or how to balance the need for having some of each so that you get enough seeds, and the fact that some of them do more work than others, I suppose, in terms of getting you into the next room. But as you progress through the caves, you start to see how randomized actions of plants lead to interactions that you didn't actually choose. Like maybe one plant will start watering another one, or another plant will be planting its own seeds, or maybe one plant is killing off all of these little like crab-like creatures that are called phyta, and then the other plant is feeding them with its seeds. So the whole cave starts to act like a system where like the sum is sort of greater than its parts. And the effect is so pronounced actually that sometimes you can just stand there and the game will sort of like play itself to completion in a given cave. So yeah, I thought that was insanely cool and a really good way of conveying sort of the feeling of an environmental system, even though it's a super simple, obviously like not even really a simulation. The other thing I really liked is the writing, and maybe I'll get a chance to talk about that a little bit more later.
Yeah, I think we're going to return to a lot of the things that you brought up there, but thank you for that. So Steve, to you lead, as I mentioned in the intro, a study on searching for habitable exoplanets, for signs of life, and for operationalizing to some extent how we might do that. So how did this game speak to you? It's built on crafting habitable environments and decoding strange and unexpected forms of life, as we learned in the intro, that aren't easily classifiable for the scientists as plants or animals or something else. So how does that resonate? And like, what was your reaction when you first encountered the game?
Yeah, that's a great question. The way that NASA is planning to look for life on exoplanets, which planets around other stars, is to look at the compositions of the atmospheres and look for gases in the atmospheres that are overwhelmingly produced by life and not by abiotic processes, geological processes. So on Earth, these are oxygen and methane. The abundances of these gases in our atmosphere are because of life. But we're looking at those gases on a planetary scale, and it's very hard actually for a lot of scientists to imagine these sort of biological, microscopic sort of processes operating on a planetary scale. But that's what's necessary to look for life forms on a planet, and so we're leading an effort to try to understand the planetary scale geochemical cycles that would take place on planets, especially if those planets start out with chemical compositions that are unlike Earth's. So some of those themes from the game resonate with me, in that we're trying to think of planets as ecosystems. You have to look for life forms by thinking about the entire ecosystem at a time, and also the recognition that ecosystems in some way might be universal, but there's going to be some big differences. The chemistry or the interactions of these life forms in waking Mars they're familiar, but they're not the same. And those are very common themes as we look for life on other planets.
One thing that strikes me is that this game is about habitable planets. It's about the search for extraterrestrial life, and it's clearly in some ways inspired by contemporary scientific understandings. But on the other hand, it's on Mars. And I do think in that way, there's this sort of creative liberty, I think, that we can say that the creators of the game are taking, and saying, like, this is a planet that has some iconic significance. It has this cultural significance. Everybody's aware of what Mars is and has ideas about Mars and history with it. So I was wondering kind of how the game draws on that. The game roots itself in this history of Mars in our cultural imagination, which goes back all the way to the ancient Sumerians and Greeks. In the 19th century, we see theories about canals and lush ecosystems on the red planet. And then, of course, there's contemporary movies and games. And the one that really sticks out to me is The Martian, in that these characters do find themselves sort of trapped in various ways as they go through their quest to find their robotic friend. So yeah, I wondered what each of you thought, as people who think a lot about planetary science and planetary systems, on how the game builds on this history, or how it innovates on it, how it alters the history of Mars in our imagination.
Yeah, why don't you go first, Katherine?
Okay. So I suppose I'm going to respond to the narrative part of that question rather than the science part of that question. The two main frames I would say that this fits well into are the dying civilization trope. So this starts, as you mentioned, with Percival Lowell's canal idea, but was taken up by science fiction in terms of the idea that if Venus is sort of a beginning of the world Edenic planet with jungles and stuff, and Earth is normal today, then Mars is this far future dying civilization planet with these maybe aliens civilizations who are older than our civilization, but who are experiencing environmental collapse, which is why they need these enormous canals. And this fits really neatly into that trope in a weird way. Not to include too many, no, I'm totally gonna spoil the game. It's been a long time. So I'd say that we eventually figure out that there are sentient aliens on Mars, and that indeed they've been in this long sleep, having these life support systems sustaining them underground because their planet slowly decreased in habitability. So that's definitely a good fit. The other thing that I think is interesting is that it fits into stories about terraforming Mars, which is the process of making it more Earth-like, except that in this case, because the Zoa are supposed to be Martian organisms, we're actually making the planet more Mars-like instead of more Earth-like.
Right. The movie that resonated with me that this reminded me of is not The Martian. It's actually Total Recall, the 1990 Arnold Schwarzenegger movie. And in that one, they have to discover, I think there's a lot of underground caverns there too, but they have to discover the terraforming equipment that the aliens had left there and activated. So that's what this reminds me of. But there's so much we can talk about. Mars as the frontier, Mars as the projection. The place where we project all of our fantasies about the frontier. So many directions you can go.
Yeah. Do you think, Katherine, that this is a frontier story? As someone who I presume has played around with that idea as a literature scholar.
Yeah, definitely. I think we might have a chance to talk about this a little bit more later on, but I do think it is. And I think it has a lot of the problems that a frontier story has as well, in terms of despite really appreciating the representation of characters in this game, I think there's a disturbing colonial violence here underlying the surface of the game in terms of sort of basically colonizing a planet that has already existing people there, or some kind of people.
Yeah, I actually, maybe we could just talk more about that, because I think that one thing that happens very early on is that it becomes clear that your activity in exploring the caves is changing the caves and even causing disruptions or cave-ins. And actually, this would be a good time. We have a short video that can sort of show how this unfolds. There's this idea early on in the game that that perhaps the planet should be protected, and that its systems as they are should be respected, and then that quickly changes for the characters. So I'm wondering if we can run that video real quick, and then we'll pick up from there.
Leon, if you didn't get that last transmission, here's what I was saying. Head back to the outpost, use the map. It will allow you to travel instantly.
Attention! This passageway has recently collapsed.
That is true. Amani was correct in her assessment of the danger.
I have determined that it is 73.570% likely that Octo progressed this way.
And we know one thing at least. To continue our hunt, we will need to get deeper into this cave.
So, what'd you think about Leth Cavern?
It is a place taken from a dream. How lucky we are to have been chosen for this mission. But I am very concerned about structural integrity. We have been reckless.
You're talking about that acid slime? I've got some new data. I noticed it has a distinct chemical fingerprint, so I wrote a little solver to find source locations. I used a second order approximation for the diffusion functions, which would be accurate enough. You agree?
Yes.
So, check this out. This is derived from Octo's report. The slime was already here, even back then. Here's what it looks like now. Even distribution, much higher density.
So for the past 8 months, the slime has been traveling through rock and reproducing. Burst of activity was caused by my actions today?
Definitely. Turns out it's triggered by compounds the halide release. You grew the halide, the acid started dripping. This acid is incredibly corrosive too. The cave is basically dissolving away. It's crazy.
This is worrisome. It seems our impact is causing rapid changes that would not occur naturally. The cerebrain are the cause. Perhaps we should dig around them rather than continue raising biomass. We must reconsider our approach to the mission.
News. Scans report that you are awake and have suffered without permanent injury.
Is there a passage back to the outpost accessible from here?
Yes, accessible to air particles. A human is too large.
And I will have to search for some other way out of the cave.
You no longer contain any protocaps.
Yes, but I can grow my own. Starting with just one seed, I can obtain as many as I need.
So this moment in the game, it charts a sort of turn in the story, which is that up until now, there was this idea of planetary protection in our current discourse about space. So there was this idea that perhaps their impact on the planet, Liang and his team, should be limited and should be restrained by a certain set of scientific norms. Very quickly here, it becomes a survival situation because of the acid-related chemical reaction and sort of chain reaction that they set off that leads to the cave-in. So I was hoping we could all talk a little bit about planetary protection, that the two of you could tell us a little bit more about it, as people who probably know quite a bit more about it than I do, and talk about sort of how the game deals with it, both narratively and then how it kind of suffuses the entire experience.
Yeah, maybe I'll go first and
Please
just
do,
say
yeah.
what NASA tries to do with planetary protection. And maybe a lot of people think that they're trying to protect Earth from the samples that we bring back, sort of prevent an Andromeda strain sort of situation. But, you know, it's really unlikely that we would bring back anything hazardous. And anyway, it is kept under quarantine. But no, NASA takes very seriously the idea that we might contaminate another planet. And you know, one of the overriding questions of science in the exploration of these planets is designed to answer this question of you know, did life arise independently, or or at least maybe within our solar system, maybe planets exchanged material through meteorites or something. But we want to answer those questions. Did it arise independently? Did we have a panspermia sort of situation where life was shared among planets, or is there just no life on those planets? And that's a really important question to ask, and you can't answer it once you've brought Earth life to these other planets and contaminated them. And so all those spacecraft are sterilized as effectively as they can be. And when the missions of some of these missions end, the spacecraft are directed, like the Cassini spacecraft was directed to go right through Saturn's atmosphere and burn up rather than risk crashing onto one of the icy satellites and contaminating it. So it's something NASA takes very seriously for those reasons. But it's, you know, once we start colonizing and sending people to these places, I don't see how you can maintain that. So it's a little bit hopeless. And I remember in Kim Stanley Robinson's books, the Mars trilogy, there's just a throwaway paragraph where they think they discovered life, but that looks like Earth life and they don't know. And oh, well, we're here too late. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and here, yeah, we're certainly, as you all can tell from the intro and the splash screens, we're in a situation where there's already like a structure, a human structure built on the surface of Mars that looks a lot like the Schwarzenegger film's dome structure. Katherine, what about planetary protection? And especially because you brought up environmental humanities earlier, I think that feels really germane to as a perspective to take on planetary protection, maybe.
Yeah, I do also kind of have a like follow-up question for Steve that maybe I can sort of say and then pin for after my response. But that I am curious about this premise that they already know that there's life on Mars, because, you know, when they first see the alien species, they're like, oh yeah, this is the one that our robot found. So they know about it, but they're still doing what they're doing, which is exploring. And I am curious about whether that seems plausible to you. Not that it's important for science fiction to always be fully plausible, but just the question of like the ethics of that and whether those ethics would be more carefully considered. Can we imagine a future where we leave alien species alone? Is a question I have. But yeah, so I think it's interesting to think about how any piece of science fiction works both as a way of thinking about the actual thing it's talking about, and then also probably a way of thinking about like life on Earth in the 21st century. And you see a lot of different models of ecological thinking here. We see at first like conservation thinking. Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy is a perfect place to go to think about that, Steve. There's that whole debate between the Reds and the Greens, where unlike on Earth, it's the Greens who are sort of wanting to make the planet more useful for humans, and the Reds want to keep Mars the space that it naturally is. So they're interested in conservation. We also see some catastrophic thinking, because the caves are this like last refuge for life when the surface of Mars becomes uninhabitable, which makes me think about how like ecosystems change over time even without human intervention. So it's not necessarily possible to like preserve a planet. Like, when are you preserving it? Where are you freezing it in time? Which is not to say that we should use that as an excuse to colonize things. And then we also find out that the environment is actually designed by sentient aliens. So even like the acidification and the cave-ins are on purpose, because the aliens are trying to like make the life in the different caves intermix at the proper moment, which is funny because it kind of suggests this alternative to Arthur C. Clarke's third law that any technology that's sufficiently advanced is indistinguishable from magic. Instead, this is like a sufficiently advanced technology that we can't tell apart from ecology. So yeah, I think that when at the end I'm gonna totally spoil this game. When at the end we have to make a decision about the future of Mars and its environment, the character Liang points out that inaction is also a decision. And I feel like that's more about Earth than it is about Mars. But it is an interesting question, like what does it mean to preserve a planet?
Yeah, it does. I mean, it is a very Anthropocene game in a way, because it's a game that foregrounds the idea that all ecosystem interactions between non-human species are mediated by humans. And, you know, as you said, science fiction is a lens for thinking about life on Earth at this moment. We're in the middle of all of the transactions between other ecosystems and among ecosystems, between geographical features and the living creatures that inhabit them. You know, through all kinds of different activity and pollution and extraction and development, we've put ourselves in the middle of that. And this game almost literalizes that through the gameplay of you having to actually like move seeds around and you know, manage the interaction of different creatures. It really reminds me of like the disciplines of like forestry and resource management, ways that presumably what we approach as previously organic ecosystems become these managed ecosystems. And in this game, of course, like you said, the reveal is that there is a grand design and Liang's actually acting within somebody else's design. But it appears at first what he's doing is kind of parallel to what we do on this planet, which is that we crash into all these ecosystems and then it's our job to manage them in some way or another and try to apply human frameworks to, you know, and ethical frameworks to get to the question you asked, Steve, to decide what the best courses of action are once we've kind of taken them out of balance a bit.
Yeah. Yeah, to address what Katherine asked me, I mean, NASA is composed of very deliberate, slow acting, you know, these mission plans for Mars. The exploration of Mars is something that's going to be multi-decades. And the further out in the solar system we go, the longer it takes. So it's something that NASA is very deliberate about, and they are deliberate from a scientific standpoint. They want to make sure they are able to, for future generations, to test the hypothesis. And there's an ethical component too, and NASA is engaged in thinking about the ethics of this. But as Kim Stanley Robinson's books made very clear, the exploration of Mars in real life may be mediated by corporations, and corporations have completely different priorities. And it's about resource extraction and colonization. So that's probably the way it's going to go.
Katherine, I wonder too, one thing I've been interested in talking with you about around this game is the questions that this ecosystem management game, this gardening game that turns out to be a more complex kind of ecosystem shepherding game, raises questions about like what ecosystems are and what protecting them means. So I was kind of wondering what you think, you know, even when we talk about planetary protection or when we're talking about managing Earth ecosystems in the Anthropocene, like what do we mean when we're saying protecting an ecosystem at this point?
Yeah, this is a conversation that the environmental humanities has been having really intensely for the last, maybe it's like a really long time now, like 20 years. That there was sort of throughout the 20th century, there was this idea of balance and sort of succession ecology, which inspired the idea that like on Earth, ecologies would work together to sort of like bootstrap their way into this like stable old growth forest, which is the correct form for an ecosystem, and that everything is in balance with itself, and that bad things happening in the environment are always the result of like people doing something wrong, more or less, or maybe not people doing something wrong, but something going wrong. And then I guess because of the Anthropocene, I suppose, we've started to think more about like catastrophes and the ways that like even the history of Earth has been punctuated by these huge extinction events. The like catchphrase that captures this best is the name of Donna Haraway's book, Staying with the Trouble. This idea that we need to think about environmental catastrophe and a planet in environmental catastrophe in ways that don't assume that that a system's no longer natural once it is broken, or once it is not as healthy as it could be, or what have you. That you have to like work with the messy system that you have, and that this idea of natural balance is so easily overblown or so easily turned into an excuse for, say, environmental racism, or for giving up on like sort of what we call sacrifice zones, right? Places that we've given up on and allowed to be increasingly bad because they're not natural. Yeah, so I don't know if that quite answers your question, but does it kind of?
It does, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. It strikes me, and I think I've mentioned this to you previously, but that, the kind of dialogue around environmental justice, I've found, and even at the level of the United Nations, is increasingly turning towards seeing the role of human communities in preserving and sort of stewarding ecosystems that are changed but still extant. There's studies that show that, for example, indigenous and tribal populations all over the world sustain and sort of steward and protect a huge percentage of the Earth's biodiversity. And that is at odds with the way I think we've been encouraged sometimes to think about the environment in the West, which is as a place of purity that is unsullied by human interaction and human contact. And so it's been an interesting thing. And I think talking around this game and the active role that it plunges you into in these ecosystems is a sort of interesting way to deliberate on some of that stuff, and made some of the things that I've been thinking about in a very abstract way real for me. So
yeah, I agree strongly. This idea of getting the player in the mix and stewarding this ecosystem is really important. And I wasn't aware of that book, Katherine, but it resonates with me a lot, because I've actually thought about climate change and gone to a few conferences and seen the way a lot of scientists approach this, and they it's very either or, black or white. And it's either we go back to having no human presence, no footprint on the climate, or we have failed. And that's an unattainable goal, frankly. Here's a sobering statistic. Human civilization actually uses so much energy per year. It's about 40% of the entire energy captured by all photosynthesis on Earth right now per year. So we are forevermore, barring a disaster, we are forevermore a major part of the climate and the planetary geochemical cycles, et cetera. So we have to manage it. There's no going back to a wild nature.
So, Steve, I must ask you the question that Katherine posed and then hit pause on, which is, can you imagine, as someone who's studying exoplanets and habitability, us finding a non-human form of life somewhere else in the cosmos and kind of leaving it alone, deciding to take a step back from it?
Well, maybe I didn't answer it very directly, but NASA would probably take a very slow, deliberate approach that would interfere in minimal way with the ongoings of the ecosystem. But I doubt that a non-scientific exploration agency would. And so I think that, Elon Musk will get there first. You tell me what he's going to do. I don't know.
So I want to actually step back, if I can, to gameplay a little bit more overtly. And we'll return to some of these broader issues that I really want to keep talking about them. But and I want to remind everybody to use the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and we'll have some time to look at any questions or comments that you have and have Katherine and Steve respond. So we won't show a clip for this, but at one point relatively early in the game, Liang, the character you control, refers to these caverns that you're exploring as a peaceful place. All this terrible stuff's happening, and all these strange, almost monstrous kind of giant creatures are surrounding him. But he says he feels strangely at peace, and it actually made me think. It felt less thematically poignant to me as kind of gameplay poignant to me. So it makes me think that this game is a platformer. It's a little bit similar to a classic series of games, the Metroid series, where you're sort of like jumping between platforms. Here you have a jetpack, and there's even a subgenre called Metroidvania, where you're using different kinds of gear to open different parts of the environment. Those games often involve some backtracking and having to like unlock different chambers with gear you get later in the game. And in this game, the gear you keep getting are different kinds of seeds for more and more complicated and unexpected versions of these Martian life forms. So I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about this game as like a relationship with the genre and the way that it's a blend of all of these different genres, and how it tweaks some of those genres as it kind of blends and hybridizes them. So Katherine, maybe you can help me with that a little bit. I'm going to throw it's definitely a platformer. It's definitely a Metroidvania. The moment-to-moment play feels like a lot of games in that genre. But what else is in there?
So the reason it's surprising to call this a Metroidvania game is because this kind of game, Metroidvania games, are known for being like punishingly difficult. And almost all of them involve fighting a lot of enemies. Whereas Waking Mars is extremely forgiving, and it's almost like has no direct violence in it, except like plant on animal, plant on human violence. And so thinking of this as like a cross between, say, a Metroidvania game and a gardening game is kind of interesting. And it maybe makes Waking Mars ahead of its time. I was gonna say like definitively makes Waking Mars ahead of its time. I feel like Joey, you and I in like a previous conversation did say this. But
yeah, I'll own it.
I thought about
I did say it was ahead of its time, but I don't have the facts to back it up.
Rather, I think it's ahead of its time in combining these things. I think it's an incredible game, but I believe that gardening games are increasingly popular. Like Animal Crossing and Stardew Valley are really good examples, especially in this pandemic, of games that everyone's playing. And there are a lot more sort of gardening related or garden themed games out there that are very popular. And I think this is because gardening games are usually thought of as like relaxing and non-violent and maybe escapist a little bit. And there's this connection between them and casual gaming, which is a term used to describe the kind of gaming that isn't hardcore gaming. So a sort of spectrum of engagements with games from like, Candy Crush to like Stardew Valley.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, a lot of these farming games I think are the on-ramps for people who are skeptical of, often what I think they perceive as like a more violent norm for video games, are these games that emphasize harmony in kind of a low-key style where it's hard to quote die or literally die as you can.
Right.
Well, it's also hard to die in this game.
Like a more accessible genre, right? Because dying doesn't mean you lose all your progress, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But I recently found out that, or I knew this, but I sort of made the connection that Alenda Chang wrote this book called Playing Nature, where she wrote a lot about farming games like Farmville. And that made me realize that there's actually this really long history to the gardening game that is actually a little bit more problematic than I originally wanted to make Waking Mars. Her claim, at least, is that this kind of game is more like a model of neoliberal economics than of ecology, in that it has this like closed system where everything is like 100% efficient. There's no loss, there's no waste, etc.
I would say that's true, except that, as you know, I did get terribly stuck in one of the rooms where I planted too many plants. There's plants later that shoot fire, basically, and they were burning up all the other plants, and I caused a total ecosystem collapse and became very despondent.
No, you can definitely get invasive species and things like that, or maybe that term is not a good choice, but yeah, you get things that act like invasive species. So it is more interactive than something like Farmville, for sure.
I do think, and as you've talked about some of these examples, I think it brings up a couple other genres that I think are at least close to this, which is, one is simulation. As you pointed out, you can sometimes just stop in a room and the room will solve itself because the ecosystem has been developed to whatever kind of threshold it needed. And maybe you got the geometry right because the creatures tend to shoot off these seeds in certain directions. So if you just happen to get the angles right, you might get lucky. It's also kind of a puzzle game. There's a little math involved sometimes because you're not quite clear from the clips we showed, but you have to hit a biomass number, and each creature in the room has a certain biomass. So you have to, and different creatures have different levels of biomass. So sometimes you want to kind of select for certain creatures. And as it gets into the harder rooms that are a little more difficult puzzle-wise, there is a little bit of quantitative reasoning going into it. I think that's where it really tripped me up, actually. Yeah, but you don't have to worry about that so much early on at all. Not to intimidate anybody off the game. It's really just arithmetic. Yeah, it's also kind of, it's a science fiction story too. I think it's worth saying. You lauded the writing, and we only showed tiny little snippets of the plot, but this is a space exploration story. We've brought up a few of those, including Kim Stanley Robinson's excellent Mars trilogy. It's a story about human AI interaction. We've seen a lot of those in the past couple decades. I think it is this maybe if you start scratching at all games, they end up having this level of a blend of literary and filmic genres, but it really does feel like it touches on a lot of different things, both inside and outside of games. All right. First thing, I want to remind people again to send in questions. We've already had a few very good ones that I'm looking forward to getting to. I guess I do want to bring up something about the characters. We can stay with the game's kind of representational politics for a minute. So, we'll point out that just to date, only 500 or 600 humans have been in space. And from what I could tell, about 65 have been women. And the vast majority have been white. As many people know, the US and Russia are the source of most people who have been in space, astronauts and cosmonauts. But here we see an organization called the GSA that seems to run space activity. Katherine, I think it's the Global Space Authority, although I don't think the game ever tells you. And we see a more diverse cast of explorers. So, both in Liang and his companions, we see people who aren't just white men from the US or Russia. And yeah, so I was kind of wondering about, Katherine, about the representational choices that the game developers made, in the context of gaming in the 2010s. And also just your thoughts about, does the game represent an optimistic future for humans in space? What does it mean that they made these particular choices?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I really liked about this game the first time I played it was the sort of representational choices. I liked the idea that the sort of first two people to in person explore Mars might be an African-American woman and maybe a Chinese American man, or I'm not sure exactly. We weren't given enough information. And I do think that in terms of critiques I've heard of the sort of representational politics of games in that time period, that oftentimes people, scholars of race and queerness in games have said that it's sort of problematic the way games would allow you to design your player character to look however you want, but that would not necessarily influence gameplay. So your character could be any apparent gender or any apparent race, but the game would work exactly the same. And this game dodges that mostly because you don't customize a character. The characters are very specifically whoever they are, and they don't change based on how you play through, I suppose. I'm not sure how much else I have to say about the representational choices. Other than, of course, that it makes me ask we don't know much about Earth, so what kind of future would it take us having in order for this to be how it plays out?
Yeah, this reminds me of a couple of books written by a fellow at our center, Deji Bryce-Alukatun, Nigerians in Space and After the Flare, which imagine a significant Nigerian space program. But they also imagine a significantly reconfigured geopolitics for the Earth. There's, sub-Saharan Africa in Deji's near to moderate term future is a fairly dominant global power and has displaced some of the current global powers. And so we see space exploration and sort of activity in space as tracking power on Earth. So it does make me wonder, kind of in the way that, science fictional texts like the Jetsons make you wonder, what's going on, back on Earth? And have we reached a kind of Trekkian Federation enlightened state? Have a different set of countries or agglomerations of political entities taken power? But we don't get any answers there. We do sort of see fairly advanced AI and obviously very sophisticated space technologies. I really like the character of Amani. I think she does an incredible job of voice act. The voice actor is quite good. And I did just on a basic level and appreciate, again, in the context of 2012, in gaming, the idea that a woman of color was kind of the person who had the most knowledge and most sophisticated analysis of the atmosphere. We're not showing a lot of that, but like the Martian geology and atmospheric science and stuff is all mainly delivered by Amani in conversation with Liang, and they develop a kind of interesting back and forth where they have just different scientific styles, I think.
Yeah, I really appreciated that too. I really liked the characters. I liked them for their differences. And, you know, it's not just a different color face being the same character. And that's especially important. And I think we all gained some awareness of that lately. But yeah, infinite diversity and infinite combinations or whatever. Yeah, I think that it's important to do this in science fiction. It influences how we actually do real science in the future. You know, so many people were inspired by Star Trek for doing that, and I like to see that continue.
So that actually leads me, you know, it's time that we get to some questions from folks, and we have a few, and it leads me into one that we just got from Benjamin. Thanks so much, Benjamin. So he asks, to what extent other scientists or scientists that you all know play science fiction video games or engage with other science fictional media beyond perhaps maybe the most mainstream obvious movies and shows? I'm assuming he means Trek and Star Wars and things like that. Yeah. But to what extent does science fiction impact folks' scientific thinking? And so I'd love to hear what you have to say, Steve. And then I know, Katherine, this is actually really relevant to your current research project. So I'd love to hear what you think as well.
Yeah, so I am a scientist and I work with many other scientists, and you know, I work with a variety of fields. Of course, I'm an astrophysicist. I work with a lot of planetary scientists. I also work with geologists and chemists and the like, and a lot of different ages. So I can tell you that there's a generational aspect and a field-specific aspect. If you are in planetary science, you almost certainly are engaged in science fiction at some level. I think the gaming is more generational. That kind of came after my generation a little bit. I just turned 50, so I think that a lot of I played a lot of Civilization, which is not exactly science fiction, but it starts with the formation of the planet, and then it ends with you going to Alpha Centauri, and so those resonated with me. But yeah, certainly younger generations play more games, but definitely, yeah, I would say at least half of all the scientists in my field, fewer in geology, but at least half the people in my field are like, I've read a lot of books and definitely seen the movies, and it inspires us and shapes our thinking for sure.
Katherine, I know we could talk about this for like an hour, but I also know it's, you know, so I know it's so central to your research. But yeah, what role do you think engaging with this stuff beyond the really obvious media, what role does it play in being formative with scientists you know and just the field as you understand it?
Yeah, it inspires us, and then it.
I was kind of aiming that at Katherine, although you could
sorry.
continue. Sorry, I just didn't want to. I didn't want her to feel cut off.
Go ahead.
I'm really excited to hear Steve say what he said, because I think that a lot of my research involves basically combing the internet for scientists mentioning science fiction. And so I have a little bit of a selection bias where my interest is how does it do the influencing, and therefore I don't necessarily, I love hearing a 50% statistic. That's delicious. But as far as how it influences, I think probably in a lot of different ways. The most important way I'd say is that I think science fiction does a lot of, for lack of a better term, like agenda setting in terms of like laying out a consensus future of like what we sort of expect might happen, which is work that scientists usually aren't prioritize, or I don't want to say aren't allowed, but don't feel comfortable doing in their professional roles as scientists, right? This sort of like broad speculation about like, here's what we think will happen, blunt statement. You know, you can say that as a person, but you can't necessarily say that as like an expert if you don't know what the future is going to hold. So I think science fiction does a lot of this, like, here are how things are related, here are how we expect concepts to work, that kind of thing. But I also think that science fiction writers respond to scientists really closely. So it's more of a feedback and a kind of like a group cultural construction relationship, not that I think that science fiction is actually just doing things to scientists or vice versa.
Yeah. Steve, did you wanna continue the thought that I
Yeah,
mentioned
I
too long?
guess,
Since Catherine is interested, I would love to hear it.
Yeah,
Good
I
for her
think
research.
obviously science fiction inspires us. You know, you like to imagine it's the gateway of how we get involved in, as kids, and then we want to do it in a more productive way as adults. But it also surprisingly provides a shorthand language. And one of the most common examples is anytime you're talking about non-carbon-based life, it's just shorthand. You say, oh, the Horta from Star Trek, the silicon-based life thing. And a lot of concepts like this maybe have come from a small number of scientists that somehow it gets into the science fiction community. They communicate it more widely, and it comes back to the scientists, and we have a shorthand way of talking to each other.
So I want to shift to another question. This is the first question we got from Samuel. And Samuel, thank you for sending a question in so early. That's model behavior. So he says he's wondering how thinking of life as an ecological or systemic planetary phenomenon leads to certain conceptions of what life is that might be very different from genomic or microscopic conceptions of life. This is a two-parter, so I'll let you all take it, given we don't have a ton of time. But has this shift in thinking led to new approaches to the question of life in science? And can we see a related shift in science fiction or science literature?
Can I take the first one and give the second one to Katherine?
There you go.
Yeah, I would say that when it comes to the question of the origin of life, how did life arise? Would it have arisen in another planet? We tend to come at that from biology, which looks at single-celled organisms and thinks about the chemistry, et cetera. But I think there's been a growing appreciation that especially early life doesn't exist as this encapsulated thing. It's more just an extension of geological, geochemical processes, and we have to understand it in that larger context as something that's kind of an epiphenomenon on top of the planetary geology. And that's helped shape our thinking about how we think about the earliest life metabolisms and processes. So that's all I'll say about that, though.
Anything to add, Catherine?
That's so cool. I love the idea of life as an epiphenomenon. Seems true. And science fiction has responded to this in a variety of ways. A lot of it has centered around the Fermi paradox. I think in most recent years, you can think about the three-body problem, a novel by Liu, which is really interested in this topic of where aliens are, I guess, which is not quite the same concept, but it is sort of in the sense of thinking about how planets generate life as being a way of thinking about it. So yeah, I'm gonna stop there because there's so many other amazing questions, but I hope maybe we can get to at least one more.
There are a lot of good questions. Yeah, we'll try to take, I think, two more if we can really do it. But okay, so both Stephen and another attendee had sort of similar questions. And so they're all about sort of, Stephen's question is about an alternative version of this game. Could there be an alternative version that modeled a more respectful, less colonial type of exploration? Do you feel like the options for engagement in non-Earth environments are binary? Is it all about either interacting or not interacting and then ruining or preserving the environment? Is there another way? And then somebody else asks, what could be the next step in games like this? And what could be the potential for helping us think about the issues raised today if you had a game that kind of responded to some of the issues and themes that we brought up in our conversation?
Can I respond to the part about thinking about a better, how the colonialism could be handled better? I think there was also a last question that asked that and sort of asked about the relationship between the colonialism and the representational politics in the game and why they feel like they're at odds. And I think that actually helps me answer all three of these questions, which is, or my answer at least, I don't think it's the answer, which is that science fiction often does this, where in order to deal with chewy issues, such as the colonialism inherent in exploring a planet, you have to represent them. You can't just be science fiction will not explore this planet because that's wrong, or something like that. In other words, science fiction's job isn't to model the ethically preferred or ideal events. Science fiction's job is to sort of throw up the possibilities and give us a chance to reflect about them. So I actually think that the game handles the colonialism in a way kind of well, in that, like, yes, it is representing colonial activities taking place on this planet, in the sense that, you know, humans come in and do stuff to this planet. But it has characters, and this is where I come back to like how good I think the writing in this game is. It has characters sort of reflecting on how they find these actions problematic, even as they're sort of happening. And so it gives you this wonderful sense of like the idea that there might be alternative possibilities, and that what happens isn't the only thing that could happen. So yeah, I actually think that it's not necessarily a bad thing that it represents things this way, because it doesn't do it in this extremely triumphalist, like this was all inevitable because of the greatness of human curiosity kind of way. It's not inevitable. It's like a set of choices that are made because of context in various ways. Even the context of when you put a human on Mars, then the privileging of human life that we tend to use as humans becomes like the primary issue. Whereas if you never put a human on Mars, you don't have that problem, whatever that means.
Yeah, it's the constant constraint they act under, is there's an unspoken agreement among all parties, including the AIs, that the humans' lives are the most important thing.
Even more important
even
than
on a planetary scale.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that drives a lot of the decisions they make. But as you said, there is this kind of layer of commentary and deliberation, even though they always end up making a anthropocentric choice. There is at least a kind of a little bit of light shed on that as they're making those choices, I think. So I want to squeeze in a final question, and then we'll do our closing. But just to put it as simply as I can, you know, can this game, you think, be a friendly introduction for games, for folks who haven't played many games or haven't played games in a while, or sort of don't feel part of the culture? You know, I think part of this series is trying to hopefully build some handholds in for folks who might come at games from a different angle or might just not feel at home there. So what does this game have to tell us about making games more accessible? You know, where does it succeed? Where does it maybe fall short?
I'll let Katherine answer.
Okay. Yes, I think this game can definitely be a friendly on-ramp. It was for me, at least. And I think that there are a variety of reasons that Waking Mars is more inclusive. As I've mentioned, it's you know, not very violent, and the player isn't under a lot of time pressure. It auto-saves a lot, so the only penalty for dying is like you sort of start over maybe 5 minutes earlier or something like that. It's also inexpensive, and it allows you to use touch controls and is available on laptops and phones. So it means that you don't have to buy a dedicated console. And it also has a variety of possible win states, so you don't actually have to like solve all of the puzzles in order to get to some kind of ending. When I felt like I was a gaming outsider, I had this sense that there's this like hardcore gaming subculture, like people playing, I don't know, League of Legends, and that was the center of the gaming community. But I think that really hasn't been true for a really long time, if it ever was. So there's this like huge spectrum of casual and indie game players and developers. In some parts of the gaming world, there's a lot of investments in games being inclusive, and their communities being inclusive of people with disabilities, queer people, people of color, and women. And I also think that there are a lot of people who are maybe watching this right now who are already gamers but maybe don't know it. Like if you play Microsoft Solitaire or Candy Crush or whatever, you might feel like you're not a real gamer, but you absolutely do count as a gamer, and it's important to how gaming culture develops that we acknowledge that there's not, we don't just say that a certain demographic group that plays a certain kind of game counts as gamers.
Yeah, I think this is a game you could talk about too. And that's what, you know, we've modeled that here. And like the three of us have had a lot of other conversations running up to this one about this game. It's a fun game to chat about with people. And I feel like that always makes a less intimidating experience for me, because I don't have to feel like I'm missing things or that I didn't get it or that I'm playing wrong. So that's been, as we've gotten this series off the ground a little bit, that idea of like games that give you things to chew on and talk about can be really helpful, the way we are very trained to do with books and music and TV and movies.
Hey, Joey, can I answer the last question I see there, one from Sophia?
Yes,
I just really
please.
like
yeah, just go ahead and could you introduce the question and answer it very quickly?
Yeah, she asks, could I say more about the differences in Liang and Amani as scientists? What are those differences? What effect does it have? That the game shows different types of scientific perspectives. And I think this is something that non-scientists don't appreciate, that first of all, scientists are actually humans, and we're people, and we have different personalities, and it's amazing how much our own personalities manifest themselves in the way we conduct science. And so I think it's really cool, first, that, you know, Liang is very contemplative and, you know, very deliberate, and Amani seems to get really excited about thing, oh, I put this algorithm to do this, and so she's just really proactive. And I see these types of personalities among scientists, and so it's really cool to see that discussed in this context. And then the racial dimension as well, just the idea that these people have these personalities and these way of doing science, and they also happen to be you know, non-white in different ways. And I think it's really great to remember that people are people. And I don't know, I have the impression that in other games or other portrayals, there's almost a tendency to make the token non-white person be kind of very generic or vanilla. And these are actually people, and they are scientists who are people. It's great. I love it.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Not only are the characters really individuated, and like you said, aren't these sort of like just tokenistic stand-ins for diversity, but also the game doesn't fall into the trope that a lot of even very well-written games fall into, of making scientists feel aloof, superior, socially inept, you know, all these like tropes that we have around scientists that I think are easy to fall into. And even if they're done with a lot of panache in some of these games, they do represent, you know, making the scientists seem sort of other than human in some way, instead of fully embodied humans the way these characters do.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for everybody who submitted questions. And for any we didn't get to, we apologize, but we had a bunch of really great ones. And thank you so much, Katherine and Steve, for joining us today and for making this such a great conversation. I just want to give you each a quick chance. Where's the best place to find you online and find out more about your work? And Katherine, could you go first?
Yeah, you should think about going to my website, katherinebuse.com.
And Steve, where can people go to find out more?
Yeah,
about
I am between websites right now. I'm working on a new one, but you can find me on the website for Arizona State University School of Earth and Space Explorations, scse.asu.edu.
Great. And I want to take just a quick moment at the end here, in addition to thanking the two of you, to thanking my colleagues at the Center for Science and the Imagination for making this event possible, and especially to Tyler Eglin, who helped us a lot with the videos and getting those cut and readied in time and providing all kinds of invaluable technical support on short notice. So thanks, Tyler. Keep an eye out for our next episode of CSI Skill Tree next month in August. To get notified about episodes, if you're watching on YouTube, just subscribe to this YouTube channel. You can follow us on Twitter and Facebook at ImaginationASU, and visit us at csi.asu.edu and subscribe there to our email newsletter. And thank you so much for being here with us, and thank you, the two of you, for all your time and great insights on this game and for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
All right, goodbye.